So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and we're going to talk through the plan. So the plan for today, what we want to talk through is the larger complex proposals, especially with subrecipients, and as far as planning for those relationships to be successful in getting things all together that we need, and thinking through the things that we need for subrecipients or multi-institutional proposals. We wanted to especially hit inexperienced partners because those are often the institutions or the organizations that need the most assistance from us. And we have redone this training this time to really focus on preparing proposals in Streamline. Since Streamline is new this year, we thought that it would be useful for us all if we had some extra focus on how to enter subs in Streamline and how to make sure that you're set up for success, because we know that the more institutions in a proposal, sometimes the hairier it gets towards those last minutes. Like I said, we really do welcome questions. We want this to be helpful for you all. So if something isn't clear, or you would like us to expand on something, please don't hesitate to shout out. So that's the plan. Any thoughts, concerns right off the bat before I just go on with my spiel? Good talk. Okay, so we start out with what is a subrecipient? We get this question more often, not necessarily as blunt as what is a subrecipient, but more how does this particular entity fit? So in your material that you got, we've included the subrecipient versus vendor versus consultant handout that's on our OSPA website. I use that all the time when we're trying to determine what the best fit is for a particular entity or person who's outside of Iowa State that we're going to put on a proposal. But I just wanted to walk through what the differences are to make sure that we're getting people in the right bucket from the beginning. So a consultant is the first item that we wanted to work through with you. And a consultant is a person. This is the only kind of entity outside of Iowa State that we can put on as a sole individual. A consultant is somebody who performs some sort of a expertise or provides a special advisory role to a project. I think of a consultant as somebody who you're just hiring them for their brain to look at what you're doing and to say, yes, no, maybe have you thought about this? They are paid to consult. They are not an individual who is along for the entire project. They're not generating the ideas with you as far as creating the new science or the new ideas that you're creating through the creative research that's happening. They are not on, they're not a key person on the proposal going in. They are not a co-author on the scientific papers that come out of it. They are just somebody that you hire to give some sort of expertise, and then they go on their merry way. The vendor is an entity that provides the same service to lots of different groups. So we could hire a vendor to run a test for us. Maybe they provide services like we could hire a vendor who does survey methodology for us and fits things in a nice way. They could also do something as routine as doing the mailings or putting together the email communication or putting a website together. That's a more classic vendor situation, but they provide the same service to lots of different entities with a standardized fee structure. Our fee-for-service centers inside Iowa State are essentially vendors internally. So then the other piece, the piece that we see the most often are subrecipients, and that's an entity. So we cannot sub to an individual. It has to be some sort of an entity. So if it's a sole proprietor, they have to have an LLC or some other legal corporation that creates them as an entity outside of a person that provides a substantial amount of work. They're a true partner through the project. So they are, they're with us when we're creating and conceptualizing the project. They work with the project all the way through. I would expect them to be contributing to the scientific or scholarly work. I would expect them to be contributing to project reports or other, annual reporting. And then I would expect them to be a partner in any outcome of the project. So that kind of, are they here for a little bit? Are they part of the whole project? That's the real litmus test that I use as far as whether it's most often a consultant or a sub. Sometimes we have folks who are actually subrecipients who would really love to pretend that they're consultants so that we can have them outside of their so that they can be paid as a consulting experience. So hopefully that's helpful. The handout that we provided, I can't tell you how many times I have sent that out to a faculty member who was considering research. So I would put that, I have that in my useful documents folder that I send things out all the time. I would suggest that as well. So once we have it that it's a subrecipient, we need to figure out how we are going to make the darn thing work. The thing that I think that one of the largest from my perspective, and I know that we see things from the cheap seats sometimes in OSPA, but the more institutions we have involved, the timelines at the end seem to get really compressed. So as soon as that project is being considered, work backwards for an ideal timeline as best you can, so that you can see what you would really want. Sometimes the sponsors don't give us those sorts of timelines because we've had to submit a pre-proposal or there's other compressed timelines, but with a lot of the large complex proposals, we are able to think through what the timeline is. So if you think about, here's the date that we're submitting, and if you'd like for me to be happy, go ahead and put in a buffer day to plan to submit the day before, just to provide that little bit of cushion. So then you think back through the OSPA timeline as far as when you're going to need your subdocs, and then you think back through the fact that that other subrecipient institution most likely has their own internal timeline because they have their own routings, approvals, and whatever. So then you need to work back on their timeline and start thinking about where we need to have that deadline structure for the internal research group to think about when they need to have their items. I also think it's really behooves you to add some buffer days in each of those. I know that some of our real experienced folks who are putting these large complex proposals together all the time have a request date and then a real date. I think that that's a reasonable expectation. I also think that it is really reasonable to have a conversation between the senior folks on the project, or maybe just the initiator, whoever's doing proposal prep, and the lead PI about where it is that the rubber, if the rubber needs to meet the road, where are the limits that we would put on timelines. I have seen some where we are waiting on subdocs from an unresponsive partner at another institution, and we have had the last minute scurry where all kinds of special dispensations were being requested to have that partnership still work out because we couldn't do the project without them. And then lo and behold, they're also on the we need help chasing this person down because they're not doing their work, or they're not. So sometimes there is a correlation between a partner who's not interested in the front end and they're not meeting their needs on once the award is made. So there are those sorts of conversations that are important to have with the PI about whether or not we know this person and we think that they can be trusted. And then there needs to be a point where we just say, we can't move forward. Either the project needs to not move forward, or we need to cut this particular institution out of the project. I think that those conversations are easier to have at the front end. And these are most often with your very large complex proposals, when you're thinking through how to do these things. It's easier to have those conversations on the front end when you're planning the project than 3 days before when you're trying to decide whether or not you move forward or not. So that's my piece about have deadlines with consequences. And I also think the sooner that you can collect the pieces that are non-technical, or you don't have to wait for that other institution's sponsored programs office to approve, I think that that's low-hanging fruit to work on. So you can look at the RFP and there's a current and pending required for each senior person, or you need a bio sketch, or you need their CV. If you can push that stuff off at the beginning, it's a lot easier to have that in line and not have to think about that on the last days when you're worried about science, or trying to get all of the components into the proposal package. And then once you do that, just communicating the expectations as clearly as possible. One of the things that I think is helpful when you're working with, especially if you're working with one other institution, which is I kind of I don't see it as much anymore, because sometimes I don't see as many proposals as I used to, but I used to have like research groups that I knew were kind of frequent flyers in my head. Like this particular researcher was going to have a PI at Purdue, and another one at Kansas State, and another one at Texas A&M. And it was like, if they were going to do a multi-institutional proposal, I almost knew the other researchers who would be involved. So in those sorts of things, we don't need to worry about it as much. But if you have that sort of one at Purdue, one at Texas Tech, and one at Kansas State, if you can find the administrators who are working on those projects other places, so that we don't have to go from person initiating the proposal or doing the proposal prep at Iowa State PI, Purdue PI, person doing the proposal prep at Purdue. If we can connect that first and just cut the game of telephone, it's faster, it's easier, and you don't have to have that delay of somebody who might be on travel, or somebody who's not that concerned about whether or not the current and pending gets in on time. So I think that if you can make that connection and then give them a checklist, you probably have gotten these are the 4 things I see on this proposal, and are rolling your eyes at me right now. But I think that it's easier if you can just check things off a list rather than sending 4 emails. I need this, I need this, I need this. So I think you can work. And Jackie's telling us that Nanovaccine Institute has a good checklist. So certainly talk amongst yourselves on what those checklists might be. So then what OSPA needs. At the initial review, all we need is the budget amounts for the sub. So 8 days ahead of time, we need the budget to be finalized and submitted to us so that we can finalize the budget ahead of routing. So what I would advise to you is having a conversation, and I know that others expect this as well, because we get times when we have edits in OSPA for a budget and we need to hit the exact same dollar amount. If you set in those initial conversations about how much each partner needs to do their piece, if we have a dollar amount that's how much that subrecipient has, and if they need to change their budget, they need to do it internally. With the exception of the proposals that need to hit direct cost and indirect cost limits. So if it's an NIH modular budget, which is less, we do have subs on that sometimes, but it's not often a lot of subs, or a USDA NIFA that has that 30%, those we need to have both the indirect cost and the direct cost at the time of the initial review, because we need to be able to have those, the sponsor is interested in those amounts. If it's anything other than those instances when we need to know both the direct cost and the indirect cost, I would set the amount that sub has, and if they have changes, they just need to hit that same dollar amount so we can submit for initial. So that way, if you have an ideal world, I think it's awesome to get the stuff 8 days ahead, but we don't live in an ideal world, and we know that other institutions have to deal with their own guidelines. So sometimes that's why the university set this up the way that it did. So at final review, OSPA needs the detailed budget, the budget justification, the statement of work, and the transmittal letter. So those are the items that we need at that final review, and the budget needs to not change. So there is a little bit of extra level of difficulty, but I just wanted to make it clear what you needed. Then the other thing, when you're submitting that checklist, I should have mentioned this before. The We have seen, and we talked about this last week at the grant coordinator meeting. I'm still not quite over it. The budget template that we have, if we are submitting an S2S, we need it to be the correct version of the budget template that the grants.gov package is requiring. So I would really pull it down out of Streamline and send that to your sub when they're doing their budget to make sure we're seeing the right budget. And I really would love to see the versioning on that budget so that we know that if it needs to be grants.gov or our budget B3-Q-4384, that's a made up number, but it's usually just version 2 and version 3. That we're able to verify it's the right one, because those errors are crazy making. So I would send that budget when you're making that initial contact. So then these are the items that I kind of indicated, the things we could do ahead of time is collect all of the bio sketches, all of the facilities and other resources, all of the current and pending, the sponsor ID for all of our researchers if we're submitting to a sponsor that has a sponsor ID that's required. This is also a nice way, and we'll get to that when we talk about the less experienced institutions. This is also a good way to make sure that the folks that we're working with are registered in the systems that they need to be registered in. But like the ERA Commons ID, that's for an NSF proposal. And NSF's mechanism that are getting their checks are getting more sophisticated, and it knows when we submit if we don't have the right ERA Commons ID connecting to the right person, connecting to the right email. And that is an error that it'll push back. So having that information in correctly is really important. And we can look them up in OSPA when it throws an error, but it's never fun when you're submitting that error and doing a resubmission. So having those things early and making sure they're in the proposal correctly is really, I think it just takes some of the heat off of that last minute. The other thing when Angie wants to talk.
Oh, I just wanted to mention that last bullet is something that I'm going to go through
Okay.
in Streamline later. So if you don't decide to talk much about it.
Yeah. And the other thing that when you're doing the initial, that's the making the request for key persons. Those are that's in your early planning to make sure you're getting those requests into us so that we can turn them back around so you can add people who are external people to Streamline. And yeah, Angie's the one you really want to see here. I talk your ear off and then she's going to show you how to do it. So stay tuned. So my next item is that I really want to encourage you to read the RFP. This is probably another square on the Andrea bingo card that Angie's was alluding to earlier. It's just heartbreaking when we read the RFP in OSPA days before the submission needs to go in, and we realize that we're not eligible to submit the proposal because we aren't the right kind of land grant institution for that particular call, or maybe we need to, for some reason or another, it isn't open to us. So please read the RFP before you submit. There's sometimes limitations on who can be on the proposal. We do review the limited submissions as far as what Iowa State can submit, but we can't know necessarily. There's just too many researchers for us to be able to keep track of if this person's a subrecipient on a proposal going to Texas A&M, and also a co-PI on an Iowa State project. If there's a limitation on how many if you can just submit one on a limited submission. There also might be limitations on who might be the PI or who can be co-PIs, or whether we can have subs. We've had proposals where we are not allowed to have subrecipients, and this research group has been working on this proposal together. And then all of a sudden there has to be the decision whether we're going to not submit it or if we're going to cut the subs. And that's an uncomfortable conversation to have the week of submission. So I just want to, yeah, that's my ping. And then also other things we need. One of the items that we've seen more and more of is needing to have an IP agreement in place between the partner institutions before we submit, or some other sort of documentation ahead of time. If you looking through those guidance and allowing us to have some time to scrounge that sort of stuff up is really helpful. And then just the next step after you figured out what we can do and can't do, just go through and sketch out the budget. It does not have to be explicit dollars and cents, but if there's kind of two different ways to do this initial plan, whether there's a limit on the proposed amount or not. So if the limit is $10 million and you've got, 5 different core, 5 different tasks under it, how much goes to each task, how much goes to each sub, who's leading what. But then also those sorts of limits also tell you kind of what's being expected of the project. So if the budget limit is $250,000, it is unlikely that the sponsor expects that to be a large multi-institution proposal with 4 key persons and 4 subs. So there's hints there. But once you have that, you can work backwards from the dollar amount to say kind of how much we need, or you can work forwards as far as these are the tasks we're going to have. This is about how much it's going to cost, and then carve up the pieces about who's getting where. So you can kind of sketch out almost all of your budgets. Each subs can kind of give you a quote on how much they think it's going to cost to do their piece, and then those pieces just can come together. If we have all the money in the world, then that's fantastic. We just add. Most of the time, I think there's not all the money in the world, because most projects either have a budget limit or there's a indication on how much they expect the projects to be. So most of the time there has to be some carving. My expectation is that we are not the only ones carving out of our budget. So if the sub gives you a quote, that is not the same as the price tag on a pack of gum at the grocery store. They're giving you what they think it's going to take, and we need to take all of the what's it's going to take and figure out how to either maybe limit the scope or limit the amount of effort that we're putting onto the project to make that all work. The same goes for cost share. We expect that we are sharing the cost share load mostly equally throughout the project. Of course, there's sometimes institutions that can't provide because of the resources they have, or organizations, especially for-profit organizations, that might have more. That's perfectly fine. But as a kind of rule to have in your back pocket, we expect this is a partnership. So we don't take all of the cuts. We don't expect them to take all of the cuts. Same goes for cost share. And the other piece that I think that sometimes is more difficult in those kind of napkin budgets to consider is the F&A that goes into each project. So each sub, there's there's F&A on the first $25,000 if we use our standard negotiated rate. That is about $15,000 if you're just trying to math it. So there's an extra $15,000 of F&A costs on top of whatever that individual institution's indirects might be. So make sure that you're considering those costs on how much the effort is really taking. Similarly with personnel costs, you have to put in the fringe and then the F&A on top. So sometimes that adds up quicker than people are thinking of when they're thinking, oh, a month of my time is X dollars. It's really the salary dollars plus the fringe dollars plus the F&A. And then once you kind of have that set, that's an agreement between the parties. So we stick to that budget is, in my opinion, the best way to move forward. So then that's how we do it with your larger research institutions. With inexperienced partners, it just takes a little extra. I mean, what we said here is oversight and coaching, and I think that's absolutely true. The difficulty is the balance between we need to provide coaching to help people because we're partnering with them on this project. And sometimes we need those smaller or less experienced entities to fill a role on the project that we can't do. But we also, technically, as an institution, are putting arm's length agreements together. So they are still responsible for their own budget. They are still responsible for saying that they can do the things that they can do. So we want to help them, but not be so overbearing that they don't have a say. Does that make sense? So what we're talking about with inexperienced subs, those are primarily undergraduate institutions. So, you know, your Dort College or your Simpson College, those sorts of smaller, they do a few grants a year, but they're not doing the research that we're doing on a daily basis. Non-academic entities such as nonprofits or maybe my favorite bingo is the Adair County Soil and Conservation Board. The vet in my hometown, we see them sub sometimes. We don't expect them to be as sophisticated in their grant making as we are, even though they're doing research with our researchers here. They're not necessarily set up for all of the infrastructure that we have. So I want to make sure that we are paying special attention to those folks. So if you're going to submit something, especially to the feds with a smaller institution, we want to make sure first and foremost that they're registered appropriately. So ask the questions, do you have a SAM registration? Another way to say this is, do you have a UEI? We're going to need the UEI, which is the number that SAM gives from their registration. If you receive money from the federal government by in an assistance type, which is a grant or a cooperative agreement, you must be registered in SAM. So that registration is a bit of a bear cat. I handle it for Iowa State, and it takes me some time every year to renew it as I'm reading through all of the terms and conditions that I'm agreeing to by submitting that SAM registration. So I would suggest if you have an entity that does not have a SAM registration, they need to take a few days to make sure that they get that submitted appropriately, and they might need advice from their legal counsel or from their board, if there's a board that's overseeing them, to make sure that they are able to agree to the things that are in SAM. There's pages upon pages of clauses that we agree to. In order to, you have to have your SAM registration, that's the foundation, and that registration is needed for an institution or an organization to register in research.gov or ERA Commons or other federal sites. So in that planning stage, we need to have that SAM registration. It takes days. It could take weeks. Our initial SAM registration took quite a few days, and that was when SAM was getting going. So I'm not completely certain how many it takes, but we generally wait, even with our renewals, we wait for days before they approve it. So you need to have days for that. And then another day or two for your research.gov or ERA Commons registrations to go through. So those are not planning. We need to plan those in advance rather than have the day of the deadline, we don't have this person registered or we can't enter a budget in research.gov. So I think that's an inexperienced partner question that you should ask right straight away. We also want to make sure that we have a copy of their F&A rate agreement. What we see sometimes is the government will negotiate a one-off rate agreement with an entity because there are real overhead costs and it's fair to have those costs recouped. But sometimes it's difficult to understand the difference between a negotiated rate agreement and a rate that you have negotiated, which Why wouldn't it be? Those are the same words, but in different order. So we like to see the F&A rate agreement from our partners so that we can make sure that they have that NICRA, the negotiated indirect cost rate agreement, in place, and that it's being followed appropriately. Generally, those are with HHS or ONR, which is the Office of Naval Research. We do see some as well with the Department of Energy will do the negotiated rate agreement. So I've seen a couple of those recently, so I think that they are emerging in that business, but we want to see that from anybody who's not a federal entity or a research institution. We can, and they can also redact the heck out of it. I just want to know that they have it. I don't care about all of the details. Then once you have the documents from that entity, I think that you need to make sure that they have the things that they need. I wouldn't hesitate to provide them a sample letter of commitment if they need some help with language. I would really I would pre-edit it for them. If I had a nickel for every time we'd received a rate or a letter of commitment from my favorite friends at Adair County Soil and Water Conservation that said that they were a member of the Federal Demonstration Partnership and that they were in compliance with the financial conflict of interest policy and blah, blah, blah. All the yada yadas that are in the second paragraph of Iowa State's transmittal letter, I'd have several nickels. We know for a fact that these folks aren't doing it. It's our exact language and they just took it and signed it. So set them up for success by not giving them a document that is gonna, if they fail to read it, it's gonna make them a liar, because we are we're an authority figure in those sorts of relationships. They think that we know what we're doing, so they sign blindly. So make sure that you're helping them by providing them either a document that is formatted for what they need or provide advice on how to format. Same goes for the budget template with our tuition rates in it. It's one of my favorite games. You can give them a budget template or show them ours, but help them do well. So then once you get the information back, I would take just a minute to make sure that things are in the right order. Make sure that the budget is in the right budget form for S2S submission. Make sure that their current and pending is formatted correctly. I think that those of us who work in the grant world and who've been here a little bit of time forget how much inside information there really is to some of this formatting, and how many places you could really misstep on an application that could get it tossed out, that just a minute of thoughtfulness and review can help. So I would just really advise that you take that to heart and give them a few minutes. But yeah, and then the validity of the documents, that's what I was talking about the FDP clearinghouse for the Adair County Water Conservation folks. So then Angie.
So this is actually me. So I'm going to take over in a second and show you guys some things and streamline. There are some more PowerPoint slides for you to view if you choose to. They're going to just cover the high points of what I'm going to be talking about. But I just made sure that they were as close to what I plan to present as possible in case you use your notes pages for your notes. Shocker.
And then I did get a chat. I think we maybe missed getting these slides sent out ahead of the meeting. Is that true?
I thought they.
But anyway, we'll double check and make sure that you get them after the meeting for the remainder of our slides.
Okay. Yeah, I thought they went out yesterday, but if they didn't, we'll get them.
Okay. They did. I received mine at 2:27
All right.
yesterday.
So then I'll follow up with my DM. And sorry, Angie, keep going.
Oh, you're
I
fine.
was worried.
So I'm going to
Okay.
start sharing my screen. Andrea, do I have permission to?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. Okay. Somebody yell if you're not seeing it. Okay, so now that you have done everything Andrea just told you to do, and you have made some good contacts and gotten a good lay of the land of who you're going to be working with, both with subs and with the external partners, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to make sure that's set up accurately and successfully in Streamline. For some of you who are doing sub work in Streamline on a daily basis, this might be a review, and that's great. Probably doesn't hurt. For some of you who don't work with S2S often or don't have subs when you are working with S2S, hopefully this will give you some real-time guidance on how to make this work successfully for you. So I do want to refer to the email. In addition to the PowerPoint slides, you have 3 tip sheets. One is requesting an external, it says user, it's supposed to say person. We don't have external folks actually use our system. Another one is requesting a suborg, and you also have our recent tip sheet on entering sub budgets. So that's really, the content within those is really what I'm going to be going over as I go through some steps here in Streamline. So you can refer to those if you want to check back on something that I said. You shouldn't have to take step-by-step notes unless you want to, because everything is in there. Okay. So I want to talk about, to start with, locating a sub-organization. So when you know that you have 3 or 4 subs, the first thing, and you can do this before you've started your PD, you can do it after you've started your PD. The first thing you want to know is, are they in our system? That's really going to hold you up if they're not in our system and you've already routed and you're trying to beat the clock to make sure that they get in there. So one way you can do that is by going to main menu and settings and then go to organizations. I want to make sure I emphasize here that an organization in our system is not the same as a sponsor. We have separate entries, separate ways of maintaining those entries. And so if you search for an organization by going to sponsors and you find them, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to find them in organizations. So in here, I always go to organization name. I suppose if you had something else like their UEI, you could search by that. Most commonly, we're going to have their name. And most commonly, I'm going to use one of our wildcards. So an asterisk or a percentage sign are our wildcards. As you can see, I've had numerous searches here in the past where I've searched for somebody. And when I use a wildcard, I use really the baseline information. What do I know is in their name? I don't need to do more than just a few parts or even one word of their name. Sometimes if I don't know how to spell a sponsor, I'll use part of a name. So as you can see in the past, I've had a hard time spelling Massachusetts. So I would rather just search for Mass. I'm going to search for something that I know is not in here just to make sure that we see what that would be like. So I am from Lake Panorama. I don't need to do the lake. I don't want to do the lake. So I see that they're not in there. Just to check again, I'll search for lake. Here we get quite a few entries, but we're not getting that entity. So that's how I would exclude that they're already in the system, and I would decide to go ahead and request them. While we're here, we're going to look for the entity that we're going to be working with today, which is Kansas State University. So this is where you'll also confirm that somebody's in the system. I wanted to go ahead and pull this up to show you, if you do find that they're in the system, we want to check that there's not multiple entries. We also want to check that they're a complete address or entry. So Kansas State University has a complete address, which includes a 9-digit zip code. Very important for many S2S submissions that there's a 9-digit zip code. They have a UEI, and they have a congressional district. So that's what you're going to kind of be looking for. If you do come across one that you think is really bare bones and needs an update, there's also, sorry, up here, the option to, and I just lost it, but you can ask for an address update. Wrong page. Okay. So that's where I want to go next. So when you know that you need an organization, we have a new organization request form on the front page of our website, or if you find that you have to update the address. One thing I want to emphasize here as well is that we do not typically want more than one of the same organizations in our system. So for example, if you're working with an institution that also has a vet college or a med college, those might be a little bit different scenarios, but we don't want an organization to have 5 different entries because we have 5 different PIs that we've worked with 5 different labs. Does that make sense? So if you have a time when you have a co-PI at that institution that really feels strongly that their specific lab or their office address needs to be represented, talk to us. Sometimes we've had multiple organizations entered when it wasn't necessary, and then it's hard to comb through after the fact. If you're requesting an organization, we want a full address, we want a UEI, and we want a 9-digit zip code. If you don't know where to find, and we want a congressional district. If you don't know where to find those things, the tip sheets that you have will help you, will give you some hints about where to look for that stuff. But I think that it's important to remember that it's okay to just have the organization provide that to you. If you have made a contact with an administrator or you have a co-PI at that institution that's responsive, ask them to give you that information. I know for me, when I'm looking for that last 4 digits of a 9-digit zip code, it can be really hard to figure out which one I want to choose. Some metropolitan areas have 10 or 15 to choose from. And I will emphasize, like Andrea did as well, if you, I'm not sure if I'll see your chat, but if you have a chat, if you have a question, feel free to yell it out. So I'm going to go ahead and go into a PD to talk about the next thing, which would be the external person request. I'm going to search for that person in Key Personnel, but it's also an option up in the main menu in the settings. There you're going to look under Address Book. So we're going to add K-State as our sub. This is just a proposal that I prepared. It's not a real proposal. Jim Reese is not the PI on this NIH proposal, but it is an NIH proposal, which is important to keep in mind as we do some steps along the way. So we're going to see if that external person exists in our system. We're going to go ahead. I just search from the start. I don't try to enter anything into that first field. And I know that this co-PI is in our system. If nothing would have generated, then we would have known that we need to go and request that key person. It is similar for an external key person. You want to know a full address. You want to know an ERA Commons. That's not for the request, but that's for entering them later. You want to know an ERA Commons username. You want as much information about that person as possible so that we have a complete record in the system. So when you have pulled somebody in, I'm going to choose co-investigator. This is an NIH, so I'm going to choose multiple PI, and I'm going to go ahead and add that person. And now he's pulled in, but he doesn't have a unit yet. So I'm going to search. I know the number, but you may not, if you haven't done this before. I'm going to go ahead and search for a unit to add to this external person. Here you see our top unit, which is all zeros, is our external key person unit. That's the unit you're going to use every time you're adding an external key person. Okay. And I just need to make sure that I have added it, and I have not. Sometimes that collapses pretty quickly and you don't know whether it's been added or not. Okay. So now that we have, I'm sure Bueller's the wrong way to say it, but I like to say it like the movie. So I'm sure that I'm doing a really bad job at that. But now that we have this external key person in here, you need to attribute a combined credit split to the unit, not to the person. An external person does not get, for example, incentive and contribution. They stay at 0, but they're at 100% of 0 across the board. Okay, so now this person has been almost completely pulled in. I want to just show you where else you're going to have to do a double check. When I review an S2S proposal, this is one of the first places I go because this is one of the places that gives us trouble. This person's going to be pulled into an S2S form. They're going to be pulled into the project personnel form. And that form is going to look for their postal code, and they're going to want to make sure that it's a 9-digit code. And if it's an NIH, it's going to look for the ERA Commons username. So a lot of times we're going to ask you guys to go ahead and check that while you're preparing it and add that. As Andrea said, we can check it for you, and we will check it because failed submissions in a system are not easy to deal with, but we ask that you go ahead and fill that out if you happen to know it. And again, this is one where it just makes sense to ask that person to provide it to you in the early stages of proposal prep. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the steps to add a suborg. So before I do that, because I don't think that that's been checked here, I want to go ahead and go to this second panel of the main proposal information and check yes to does this proposal include subs. That first 2 panels are one of the first things that OSPA reviewers will read to know kind of what to expect about this proposal. So that will cue us in to look for more information about whether there's subs. I want to make sure this is incomplete because if I'm adding sub information, I can't add it to a final and complete budget. Oops. And if you hit the wrong one, you get to wait a little bit and hit the right one. Okay. And I'm sorry, this isn't where I wanted to go next. I want to go to orgs. So I'm going to back up a little bit. Okay. So now we're going to pull in the organization that we plan to work with. So I find that it's much easier to pull in your collaborators before you actually do the work with their subdocs. They need to be entered in both places, and there is a tool that you can use when you hit the budget to pull in the collaborators from this section. So I find that that's easier. It's not necessarily required. I also want to just take a moment to help everybody be on the same page of what we mean when we mean collaborators. We consider a sub to be a collaborator, a sub who's receiving funds to be a collaborator. If you're working on a collaborative proposal with NSF, we don't consider that as a required entry here because collaborators on a collaborative NSF proposal are all doing their own individual pieces of an application. Generally, and there's going to be exceptions, but generally, if it's an unfunded partner, an external person that you've added, but there's no sub, there's no funds attached to that person, generally, you don't need to add them to the collaborators. There are going to be times when there's an exception to that. I think we're working on when those exceptions might arise, but in general, that would be the rule. So I'm going to go ahead and just search for the sub that I mentioned earlier we're going to work with for this example. And again, it looks to be a fairly complete entry. I don't know of federal employer ID being something that we've had to pull into forms before. So we're going to add Kansas State University. And I'm going to select show for congressional districts because I want to know that that's in there. Again, this is going to feed into one or more of our forms for the S2S submission. So if that's missing, it's actually very easy to add yourself. It's very easy to search for yourself. That's in one of our tip sheets as well. one of the places you can find it. You can Google it. You can go to the institutional page of that organization, or you can go to a couple of different federal sites to find that. It's pretty easy to pull in though. You're just choosing the location and then choosing the district number, which is a 3-digit number. It's a 6-digit number overall. You've got the 2 letters for the state, the dash, and then the 3 digits. So that's in there. So now we're going to go to the budget. I kind of skipped forward earlier. And obviously, if you have more sub entries, you're going to just repeat those steps many times. Bless you, Andrea. I thought you were making a face because you had something horrible to say, and then I saw that you sneezed. Okay. Okay. So this is what I was talking about. You don't necessarily have to fill that collaborator section right up front to give us some sub information, but in a lot of cases, it just makes sense because it's much easier to just hit this button when you're in this budget section, especially if you have multiple subs in that collaborator section. I don't know that this is a required field, but since it asks for something, this is something that I'm going to look for. So we've now pulled this entity into the sub-budget area. Now we're going to talk about which sub-budget you're going to actually be providing to the sub if you haven't already, and then pulling back in and uploading into this section. So in the S2S section, if you have pulled your opportunity in, which is an important thing to do as early as possible in your proposal prep, if you have pulled your opportunity in, which you do up here by searching, you're going to see that opportunity detail right here, which means the forms that are specific to this opportunity are available. So in this case, you'll see that there is a sub-award budget attachment form. While I'm here, I'm going to hit include, because that was something that wasn't on our radar early on in the process, but this will make sure that that's included in your submission. So we are going to look at this attachment form because it is necessary in order to help us get the right form. And it's just going to take a minute to open up. Everybody's going to have, I know this is something that was talked about at the grant coordinator meeting last week. I think it was last week. Everybody's going to have a little different process as far as how to open that document, where it goes when you do download that document. And sometimes it just takes its time. So that's going to open up the sub-award budget attachment form. This is not a live document that you have to interact with and add things to in order for this submission to be submitted. This is something that kind of does its own work. It gathers your subdocs from your budget section. But where you do have to interact with it is early on to extract the budget attachment form or the budget attachment. And I already have this saved, so I'm just going to put it wherever it wants to put it. And then I'm going to open it up and we're going to look at how it looks in its blank form. This is a good time to stretch or pet your dog. Okay, so when you get this blank form, and I'm gonna pull this over for a second just to show this as well. When you get this blank form, it's gonna have its own naming convention. So this one was called R&R budget 3-0-A30B30. So when Andrew was talking about naming, and you have a handout that talks a little bit about naming recommendations, we would love to have it come back to us and be uploaded into Streamline with most of this name, if not all of it. So when I renamed this budget, I just added K-State at the beginning and I left everything else as it was. That really helps us double check if you have many subs and 2 of them out of 7 sent something back that doesn't have the correct letters and numbers at the end, we can really quickly at least start our path to determine whether they have the right budget forms. So with this budget, and again, you're going to send this to the sub. hopefully, and they're going to be filling it out, but you're going to be checking it when it comes back to you. We want to make sure that they have included their UEI, their name of organization, that they've checked sub, and that they have start and end dates for each project period that align with Iowa State's project start and end dates. One thing that happens when you add a period, so this starts with just one period and then you have to keep adding periods. One thing that happens is it duplicates those project periods. So I've received 3-year budgets before where every year is the same period, and I've gone and just changed that or asked one of you guys to change it. So you'll want to double check that against, like I said, the project periods for Iowa State. You'll want to make sure that there is a budget justification attached and that it's a flattened one. So this budget form needs to remain readable. It needs to, the system needs to be able to extract data out of it. But in general, in S2S, and in this case with this budget justification, it needs to be a flattened PDF. And if that's not something that you're doing on a regular basis, it's very simple to do. I just print to Adobe PDF. Sometimes I print to Microsoft PDF, whatever is in my print options. So that's something that you can't tell when you get it back from the sub. So that would be something that's important to give them as instructions early on in the process, especially if you suspect that they don't do a lot of S2S submissions. And I do not. Okay. So like I said, I have renamed using almost all of the original name. And I've created a budget for K-State. So we're going to go ahead and just see how that gets pulled in. Okay. Sorry, I didn't pay close. As you can see, I have a really dirty desktop. And I'm just not seeing it. Right there, it was on the top. Okay. All right. All right, so once you've pulled it in, this sync from PDF button is here, and sometimes I use it if I'm a little nervous that something didn't go right, but it's not necessary to do in most cases. So I'm going to check. One of the first places that I check is here under details. Do I have 3 full years, which I expected? Are the amounts close to what I expected? Is there distribution between direct and indirect costs? So that's kind of my first preview, and that's my first indication that this seems to have come in okay. The next place I'm going to check is in non-personnel. If you're someone that likes to check in multiple places, then this is for you. I'm going to check in non-personnel. And you'll see that this is how, and I have BYU in there. You can kind of ignore that for now. This is how that came in. So we have 13,249, which are the direct costs for, I believe we're in year 1. Yep. And the indirect cost. Also, these are categorized as burdenable in both cases, and that's because the $25,000 limit has not been met yet. In year 2, we will meet the $25,000 limit. So all of these are burdenable costs. We'll look at year 2 quickly so you can kind of see that difference. Okay, so here you have K-State. The remainder of what was needed to reach that 25,000 is burdenable, and the rest is all non-burdenable. This is done for us by Streamline when it pulls from that sub-award budget. If we were entering on our own, we don't really care what the makeup is of the direct and indirect under burdenable and non-burdenable. As long as we meet that 25,000, we're good to go. And I'll look at year 1 again, just to kind of show you what I did with something that wasn't pulled in from an S2S budget. So I'm staying in the Big 12 here, and I chose BYU. And so I just did all of the direct cost is burdenable, all the indirect cost is non-burdenable. Of course, that was by design that I chose those amounts, but you don't have to do a lot of separation if it's non-S2S and you're entering it yourself. Okay. I think that is it for kind of what I wanted to walk through in Streamline. I did mention that you have a handout. And I'm going to go ahead and pull that up. One second. Okay. I did mention that you have this handout. So this isn't necessarily new information. This was something early on when we started making some tip sheets with the final review tip sheet. Yeah, that's where this is from. We had some suggestions on how to name documents. This has since then been updated, as you can see here, to include the R&R budget form name with the naming of that sub budget. But the rest is all stuff that's just not very new. It really helps us if you do name the sub budget documents, starting with the sub's name. When we get multiple, you know, like Andrea talked about, we're expecting at least 4 documents per sub, sometimes more. So when we have maybe, you know, 12 or more documents to look through in the internal attachment section, if that's the case, or anywhere, it really helps us to quickly identify who's who and then what document you're providing.